Last but certainly not least, here at CPAC Day 1. You know him, you love him. Make some noise for Alan Jones. Give him a big hand, ladies and gentlemen.
Here we are. Now look, I know you think I'm elegantly dressed, but I'm not really properly dressed until I put my headgear on. How's that look? Can you read the NO? Albo, can you see, Albo, I know you're watching. Can you see the NO, Albo? And I've got 1,500 people who are all going to vote no. Now, let me just say I'm delighted to see you all here at the Conservative, I'm just reading this thing because I'm thinking, Political Action Conference. You see, when I look at what's been happening in Australia for the last several years, I wasn't sure there were any Conservatives left. So we've at least got 1,000 of them here. And I want to begin by saying, isn't this a wonderful set, all this stuff here? And this has been done by the team at ADH. And Jack is out the back there, and I know that they've all done a terrific work, but Martina has done all that. She's the graphic designer. Isn't that terrific stuff? So Jack and Martina, yes, please thank them. They've been going at 3 o'clock in the morning, and Charlie is back in the studios. I don't know, I'm hopeless at directions, so I don't know where that is, but it's, Chippendale. He's over at Chippendale, and then Nick's in the back room here. They've all done a wonderful job sort of putting all of this together, so we thank them for that. And look, you know, the thing is that I think that we have to accept that what we stand for will lead to us being intimidated and bullied and vilified and condemned and cancelled, but we won't be silenced. We won't be silenced. And you see, sometimes if you're a Conservative, I feel as if we're talking into an empty tank, because in recent times, in the Western world, this is true, although there's been a comeback in Europe, we know, but in the Western world, the Conservative voice has been intimidated. And because it gets bullied and vilified and so on, it backs off. Now, sometimes in life, whether it's in politics, whether it's in sport, sometimes you're beaten, not because you lose, but because you didn't fight. And we have a fight on our hands, and we've got to be equal to that fight, and we will be. It's an intellectual fight, it's a policy fight that we've got to secure. Now, I have to say to you that I was a bit gazumped today, not by the great Cater and Mundine and these people, but I picked up the paper this morning, and before I go any further, I just want to say I read a piece here by Bjorn Lomborg and Jordan Peterson. Bjorn Lomborg, as you know, I speak to him often. He's the president of the Copenhagen Consensus Centre. He's a man who speaks to scientists and eminent people around the world regularly. And the story said this: the meaningful exchange of truly diverse ideas and perspectives has withered over recent years. He said unorthodox thinking is increasingly trashed or disregarded, even as the chattering classes' fear and force predicated approaches repeatedly prove inadequate to cope with the true complexities and crises of the modern world. So they can't win. They can attack you, they can vilify you, they can seek to intimidate you, but they mustn't be allowed to silence you. They say, we need instead to foster and promote critical thinking and constructive discussion, which is why we're here. We need to foster and promote critical thinking and constructive discussion. He said, and I'll look at this in some detail in a moment, consider the world's response to the COVID pandemic. A panic-stricken lockdown orthodoxy far too soon took hold, and those whose policy proposals deviated quickly were labelled COVID deniers. Now, I'm looking at this in a moment, but I was amazed to read this a couple of hours before I was coming to speak to you. He says, governments that went the farthest, that is the most extreme, the ones that denied us most freedoms, they were feted by public quote-unquote intellectuals and in newspaper opinion pages. Don't we know about it? And they terrified people to conform. He says, thus we saw increases of inequality in income distribution and wealth, widespread loss of employment, substantive declines in spending, and general deterioration in economic conditions, serious declines in mental health and well-being, delayed and diminished access to health care, and record high levels of domestic violence. This is where we are from yielding to those people who believed they were right and everyone else was wrong. He said, we need to have, well, this is a good bit, the education of children was particularly affected. School closures on average robbed children of more than 7 months of education. The huge impact on kids' knowledge could end up costing $17 trillion in lifetime earnings, according to research by the World Bank, UNESCO and UNICEF. Poor children, girls and children with disabilities suffered the largest losses. Now, all of these things I'm going to address in just a moment, but he makes the point. Campaigners and news organisations play up fear in the form of floods and storms and God knows what. And fear it was, wasn't it? Fear, anxiety, hysteria, all dominated, and people were frightened. And I was cancelled because I alerted people to all of this. They didn't like it. But I don't care because they can't silence you. They can do lots of things. You see, one of the things many of you people, I think, most of you people, I'm sure, Liberal supporters, or if not your political people who don't have a home to go to, because you find that, you know, the Liberal Party become Labor light. Now, there's a myth surrounding all of this. And the myth is when we know that the Liberal Party in Australia have got to win 18 seats at the next election to win government. 18 seats. But the argument that's prospered, you see, is that, oh, well, the problem is the Teals and the Greens and Labor, you know, cleaned us out. And that's a complete mathematical untruth. At the end of the day, the Teals and the Greens together only got about 300,000 more votes than they would have otherwise got if the Teals hadn't been there, 300,000. The issue is this. There was a complete collapse in the coalition vote, which people would think was the Conservative vote, a complete collapse in the vote. Now, that collapsed because the alleged Conservatives, the alleged Liberals, the freedom thinkers, were more on the other mob side than on the traditional Liberal Conservative side. And so I've just got some figures here. You see, Abbott, you heard earlier today, one of the finest minds in this country, one of the most outstanding politicians we've had because he stood his ground and you knew what he stood for. But, of course, he was done over by the wets, the Liberal wets. Abbott contested those 2 elections. He won 25 seats from the Labor Party in 2 elections. But this is the key. When Abbott won government, his first attempt at winning government, there was not the first attempt, second attempt, he won, Abbott, the coalition, won, you've got to get your head around this, 45.5% of the primary vote. 45.5%. Will someone wake up? Then suddenly came 2021, and what do we get? 35.7% of the primary vote. In other words, the coalition vote, not two-party preferred, that was the primary vote for the Abbott government when they won government. When he said, we'll turn them, people knew what he was standing for. But suddenly come 2021 and the coalition had lost 10 percentage points. 10 percentage points. Does this light here work? Oh, here. It's running out of, must be running on renewable energy. I'm telling you something, we'll never be able to power the economy or the nation or industry or individuals on renewable energy. I'm telling you that now. This other bloke's taking us over the cliff and we're not going to go with him. Will someone stand up and say, Chris Bowen, you can take us over the cliff, the most arrogant and dangerous politician we've had since World War II. So what I'm saying is that when you're talking about genuine Liberal Conservative people, they've got to answer one question. Why has the coalition vote since Abbott dropped at every election since Abbott's landslide? Why? Now, the metaphor of this collapse, of course, is the former Treasurer of Frydenberg. In 2016, his primary vote, not two-party preferred, his primary vote was 58.22. 2019, it crashed, 49.41. And then, embracing the then philosophy and policies of coronavirus and energy and climate change and all that rubbish, well, what happened? 42.98. In 2 elections, a drop of 16%. Has someone got the wit and brains to ask why this has happened, or do you just ignore it, or is there no sensible analysis? So far, I've seen no sensible analysis, and the story is simple. You know, if you cease being a Liberal, if you betray the Liberal policies, then there's no reason in voting for you. So there's millions of people out there who are looking for a political home and can't find it. And the figures bear witness to this. So the lessons are very simple. But at the same time, are they prepared to learn those lessons? Now, since Tony Abbott, one other stat, since Tony Abbott returned the Conservative parties to power in 2013, the coalition has lost 650,000 primary votes. 650,000 primary votes. And there were 3 million more people registered to vote in 2012 than they were in 2013. So someone has got to say, firstly, you can't solve the problem if you keep running away from the central component of the problem. And this is what we're doing. There is a reason why people have abandoned us. And it's got something to do, I think, with the coalition after Abbott going wet and soft and Labor light. And therefore, I just want to have a look at a couple of these things that would, it's very easy, you know, because at the end of the day, it's policy that will win the day, not personalities. I mean, Albo might be a nice bloke and he comes from Marrickville and one-parent family. That's all terrific, and we love all that. And it's terrific that someone's manager. But at the end of the day, he's going to go under on issues of policy, whether they be the voice, whether they be energy, whether they be education. And I'll quickly look at some of these now. But look, there is something going on, and of course I'll be, you know, they'll go after me because I'm saying this. I couldn't give a Continental. I've been around all those traps for a million times. These things have to be settled. Now there's a stack of billionaires and, you know, corporate intellectuals and know-alls, the sorts of people that give $3 million to the Yes campaign so that they'll be able to knock on Albo's door and get some favours when next time he's looking at taxing the corporate world. Or when the rugby league suddenly get rich as all hell, get $7 million to promote rugby league in the Pacific Islands, and then, quid pro quo, we'll support the Yes vote. Oh, isn't that amazing? Isn't it coincidental? I thought that's what ICAC and these things were about, quite frankly. I mean, wouldn't you draw the lines? Qantas will go yes. We'll put yes on the planes. We'll put yes on the Qantas planes. And in return, Albo, make sure you don't let Qatar into the country for any kind of competition. Eh? What the hell? What sort of show are we running here? What sort of show? And I just don't understand why Conservative leaders don't get into the ring and go after this. I'll tell you, if you walked out there and talked to the rank and file person, they said, what issue do you want government to be challenged on and resolved? I'll tell you what they want to be challenged on and what they want resolved. How did some woman get $3 million of taxpayers' money, $3 million of taxpayers' money in a mediation that lasted less than a day, and denied the right to attend that mediation from 2 of the women who were most vilified, Michaelia Cash and Linda Reynolds? Can someone tell us how she qualified for $3 million? We send our sons and daughters to war. They tragically lose their life. When they come home, the mums and dads have to compete for appropriate compensation. The maximum they can manage is about $177,000. This woman gets $3 million. I won't make further comment than that, but I've got to say to you, the reason they're supporting Katie Gallagher, the reason Albo's we're going to support Katie, yeah, you're all in it together, Albo. You were all in it together. She told publicly, the aim of it was to get rid of the Morrison government, to make a mess of the Morrison government. I won't use the language she used, but the word starts with F. We're going to sort of F the Morrison government. It all happened. Now, I'm saying these are issues that it's our money. It's our money. Now, there's an outfit called the World Economic Forum. I mean, yes, absolutely. Oh, when these know-all corporates and world intellectuals come together, the World Economic Forum. Well, this German economist, we know this Schwab, Klaus Schwab. We know about him. Well, this is what he said. The pandemic represents a rare but narrow opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. Make no mistake, this is happening. Reset our world. Have a look at what's happening to us. Welcome to country, compensations, treaties. The world's being reset before our very eyes, and there's no one prepared, it seems, to defend our values and our traditions. You see, we have to be, in this country, what I call radical conservatives. Yes, you've got to be radical to know what needs to be changed, but you've got to be conservative enough to know what needs to be preserved and conserved. And yet at the same time, in our classrooms, we don't have education, we've got indoctrination. The parents should be marching in the streets. Their heads are being filled with this rubbish. And this is part of this reset. I'll come to that in a moment, but he said, the pandemic represents a rare but now opportunity to reflect, reimagine and reset our world. All aspects of our societies and economies must be revamped, from education to social contracts and working conditions. Must be revamped. Now this crook, and he died a crook, who was in fact the creator, the godfather of climate change, Maurice Strong, said, quote, 1992, and it's all followed since then, and we have these conferences about climate change all the time. I'll come to that in a minute, God help me. Anyway, he said, listen, we may get to the point where the only way of saving the world will be for industrialised civilisation to collapse. This is what this Maurice Strong, he's the godfather of climate change. We may get to the point where the only way of saving the world will be for industrialised civilisations to collapse. Isn't it our responsibility to bring this about? That's what he said. And what do we say? Oh, well done, Maurice. Well done. Well done. No, we don't have any response to any of that. And we don't. We don't. We need a great, he said, we need a great reset of capitalism. Schwab says all aspects of our societies and our economies must be revamped. You think this is not happening? Well, have a look at the level of debt we've got. Have a look at who persuaded a coalition government to give everyone $750 here, $750 millions of dollars to corporates. Who persuaded? Again, I'll come to that in just a moment. I just want to talk about this reset thing. Okay, there's the World Economic Forum. And at the end of the day, you see this freedom-loving dictator, oh God, I could go on forever. Look, I want to get on to some other things, but I just want to share this with you. This Utmar Edenhofer, God, what a name. Anyway, he said 11 years ago at Cancun in Mexico, this is climate change. See, this is the equivalent of this pile on that we had at Glasgow. Why, how a conservative government of any kind could yield to this, I don't know. This is what the bloke said. This is in 2010, so a couple of years ago. A German economist. He's regarded as one of the world's leading experts on climate change. This is what he said. Ottmar Edenhofer. Basically, it's a big mistake to discuss climate policy separate from major themes of globalisation. The summit in Cancun at the end of the month is not a climate conference, but one of the largest ever economic conferences since the Second World War. One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore. This is about wealth transformation. We've been warned. We've been warned. What have we done? Nothing. We got into bed with them. The alleged conservative forces got into bed with them. And the one person that's opposed to all this, Donald Trump, is demonised. Of course you'll be demonised. Of course you'll be demonised. And you'll be vilified. And you'll be cancelled. But you can't be silenced. We have to rise against this stuff. This is about wealth transformation. I mean, let me just share this. Remember, in the 2019 election, Scott Morrison was told Labor went to the election with a policy of not zero emissions, 45% reduction. 45% reduction. That's their Labor policy. The then Prime Minister Morrison said that this would cost, quote, that's 45% reduction, not zero, an additional $472 billion. He said, I'm not kidding, $472 billion. It'll slash more than 336,000 jobs. It'll cut the average wage by over $9,000 a year. It will increase wholesale electricity prices by more than 58%. That's not a sensible target. It's a reckless target, and it'll come at a tremendous cost to Australians. That's where we are now. But that was 2019. Come 2021, he's off to Glasgow. 180-degree turn. How? Why? Oh, a few bureaucrats got in his ear. And then others said, oh, the Wets, the Birminghams of the Liberal Party said, oh, we can't go this way, this is a big issue. Prime Minister, you'll lose votes. Lose votes? Any leader of the Conservative forces in this country who says we're not going to go over the cliff with Bowen will win millions of votes, I can tell you now. But you've got to say it and do it. So I know the very fine Australian Maurice Newman is somewhere in the audience tonight, and he's our very fine chairman of ADH. And Maurice and I have often talked about the post-war Marxist manifesto by former, and of course out there they say, oh, here we go, all this conspiratorial talk. I'm only reading what he said. Post-war Marxist, the agent, a fellow called Cleon Skousen, in 1960. It takes a while. Remember the musical, Evita, Eva Peron, and they had the song, Get Them While They're Young. Evita, she said, get them while they're young. Well, this is what this bloke said. Marxist, former FBI agent, but a Marxist, and a manifesto. And he talked about how we'll achieve our ends. And he said, the manifesto talked about capturing one or both of the major American political parties, using the courts to weaken American institutions. Have a look what's happening now. Using the courts to weaken American institutions. Schools becoming transmission belts for socialist propaganda. Happening now. Softening up the curriculum. Happening now. They can't tell you what river Melbourne's on, but they can tell you welcome to country and all that stuff. And then it says, abolishing loyalty oaths. That's all happened. That's all happened. Under our very nose. And what have we done about it? Absolutely nothing. So when we come to then this business welcome to country, which means we're being welcomed to our own country, which I object to. I'm as Indigenous as anybody. Check the dictionary and find out what Indigenous means. It's a nation in which you were born. You're Indigenous. Most of you here are Indigenous. So I interviewed Keith Windschuttle. Keith Windschuttle, an eminent Australian historian. He said, this ritual is now virtually inescapable. From the opening of state and federal parliaments to writers' festivals and art exhibitions, academic conferences, school assemblies, anywhere the public sector gather. Now, the World Economic Forum is committed to changing all aspects of our societies and education. Well, Lydia Thorpe is my hero. I think Lydia Thorpe's a star. I think she's given us the text for the nation. Lydia Thorpe, she has said she doesn't want the voice. She said, we have to accept the invasion and dispossession. She wants to question her words, illegitimate occupation of our country, and for people to know, quote, whose land they're on, and that the first people never ceded sovereignty. And as Keith Windschuttle said, 2 decades ago, this stuff was unknown. He said it was introduced, this is welcome to country, without public debate, let alone public support, and its authors have never been named or their purpose justified. This has been foisted, he says, on a mystified public as though it had the sanction of deep Indigenous tradition, changing society before our very eyes, and no one has got the guts to get into the public place and take it on. But at ADH, we do. That's your hope of the side. The hope is there. You see, way back in 2020, Scott Morrison addressed the nation. March 15 it was, 2020. He was 100% correct, but someone got at him. Someone got at him. He said this about coronavirus. The truth is that while many people will contract this virus, it's clear, just as people get the flu each year, it is a more severe condition than the flu. But for the vast majority, as I said last week, for the majority, around 8 in 10 is our advice, it'll be a mild illness and it will pass. However, he said, for older Australians and those that are more vulnerable, particularly those in remote communities and those with pre-existing health conditions, it's a far more serious virus, and that is our concern. That's what he said. In other words, basically it's 2020, March 15, addressed to the nation. 3 people at risk. 1, the elderly. 2, those with comorbidities. I was one of them. I've had cancer and all that sort of stuff. So if you've had that, you're in trouble. And 3, remote Indigenous communities. That's it. Get on with your life. Get on with your life. And over again, I, for one, and there weren't many of us, cited world-renowned authorities. Sunetra Gupta, the Professor of Theoretical Epidemiology at Oxford University, no less, called on Australia to abandon its selfish and self-congratulatory lockdown tactics. Ignored. Mark Woolhouse, who was a member, of the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviours advising the British government. He said, talked about lockdowns as a panic measure, and I believe history will say that trying to control COVID-19 through lockdown was a monumental mistake on a global scale. I never want to see national lockdowns again. Yeah, but hang on, these blokes were all ignored. Kerry Chant, Jeanette Young in Queensland. They were the ones we listened to. You're kidding me, aren't you? You're kidding me. I wouldn't even allow her to diagnose me with a sore thumb. And here they are dictating terms. And this is what Mark Woolhouse said. I never want to see national lockdowns again. I suspect right now more people are being harmed by the collateral effects of lockdown than by COVID-19. Ignore him. Michael Levitt, a Nobel Prize winner. I wrote to government over and over again about all this, ignored. And I tried to explain to Conservative leaders, after all the Liberal Party was in power in several states and in Canberra, Michael Levitt, a Nobel Prize winning scientist, he said lockdowns were a huge mistake. The level of stupidity going on here is amazing. This is what he said. And then Professor John Ioannidis. Now, Ioannidis is a Stanford University epidemiology professor and regarded as one of the finest minds in the world. And he said at the time, quote, if we'd not known about a new virus out there and had not checked individuals with PCR tests, the number of total deaths due to influenza-like illness would not seem unusual. At most, we might have casually noted that flu this season seems to have been a bit worse than average. The media coverage would have been less than for an NBA game between two of the most indifferent teams. This is Professor John Ioannidis from Stanford University, the Professor of Epidemiology. I made all this stuff available to the coalition government. It was completely ignored. Ioannidis said, the novel coronavirus is a serious threat. We need to prepare, not overreact. If the health system does not become overwhelmed, the majority of the extra deaths may not be due because of coronavirus, but of course because of the virus, as you know, people with heart attacks and lots of weren't treated and they died. We call them excess deaths. We've never been told. I mean, consider this. We were told the tests were free. You know nothing's free. Taxpayer pays for it. The tests were free. So go and get the free test. Get the first vaccine free. Second vaccine free. Booster free. Big Pharma was laughing. Has anyone in government ever told us how much we as taxpayers paid to Big Pharma because they had the government in their pockets? No one. That information has never been made known because both parties sang off the same sheet of music. And he said that. There are other common diseases and conditions, heart attack, stroke, trauma, bleeding, and these are killing people. Now, there are many of these people in relation to coronavirus who are completely ignored. Now, Professor Kulldorff is a Harvard University professor of economics. He wouldn't know nothing, would he? The Professor of Epidemiology at Harvard University said children and young adults should be able to live lives normally. They should wash their hands and those kinds of things, but there is no public health reason to close schools. I think these sorts of general lockdowns of closing schools, closing restaurants or closing beaches, they actually have a detrimental effect on public health. There we are. That bloke's Harvard University Professor of Epidemiology. We had a visit here recently by Professor Bhattacharya. Now, Bhattacharya is an internationally acclaimed epidemiological scientist, and he says, as a public health scientist who's been working with infectious disease outbreaks for many, many years, I'm absolutely stunned by the reaction of the scientific community as well as the media to this. And then, as I said, you've got Sunetra Gupta, the woman from Oxford, and she urged Australia, I think I've told you this, to abandon its selfish and self-congratulatory lockdown tactics and embrace a Swedish-style herd immunity strategy to fight COVID-19. I mean, these people were all ignored. And at the end of the day, there we are. I mean, people were put out of business. I mean, kids didn't go to school. We don't know the damage that this is likely to have caused. Businesses were shut down, they went broke. And at the moment, you know, what's the debt? Heading towards $1 trillion. I spoke to a lecturer. He was a lecturer at the Sydney Law School, a bloke called Jason Chin. And he is a metaphor of the problem. He had the guts to say in July last year that, about his experience, clarified for me just how grossly imbalanced the system is. I had every resource one could ask for. He had been penalised for sitting on a park bench. I had every resource one could ask for. I had legal training, I had advice, I had time and money, but the process was dangerous and unnecessary. My experience resembled that of many others who were illegally ticketed. I was reading alone in the park, less than a kilometre from home. I looked up to see two police officers hovering over me, accusing me of breaking the law for not actively exercising. They were also intimidating, threatening to arrest me when I asked if I could start exercising now, if I knew that was what the law was. He said, I used the Revenue New South Wales portal to challenge my ticket. The fine was clearly mistaken, so I thought that would be the end of it. Revenue's response stated that I was in the park with no reasonable excuse, which contradicted the public health order in force defining reasonable excuse as exercise or recreation. It doesn't take a legal background to see that or outdoor recreation has no meaning if it doesn't mean something other than exercise. So I challenged the ticket in court. Eventually he rang them. He said, I rang the bloke in charge and tell him what I was doing, and the bloke said, mate, I gave it a lot of tickets then, but then suddenly the fine was retracted. You know, we haven't resolved any of this at the moment. Michael Koziol is a journalist with Sydney Morning Herald, and I give him credit, but nothing has happened. But he wrote at the time, businesses forced to shut, visitors banned from private homes, curfews enforced by the police and the army. Bill, I was in a restaurant, South's Reunion it was, over at a lovely restaurant in Surrey Hills, and in came 4 policemen with guns. Guns. Restaurant, frightened the tripe out of people on the place. He's counting the number of people. I said, what are you doing? Oh, he said, we just told her this, we're counting. I rang the Premier straight away. So what's going on here? Gladys said to me, Alan, we're saving lives. She was very sharp. Alan, we're saving lives. I said, you're kidding. This happening in a Liberal state, a Liberal government? We're saving lives? People marching with guns? So I immediately ran Mick Fuller. I said, the police commissioner, I said, mate, does this go on? Leave it with me. Of course, nothing happened, thankfully, but this is just unbelievable. People in this country escaped these police states in Europe only to find them confronted by all of this here. Well, this Michael Koziol said, it would be fairly intellectually impoverished society that was not interested in how exactly these incursions into everyday life were decided upon and what effect they had on curbing the virus. The lack of curiosity about these matters is astounding. He said, even after more than 90% of the population was vaccinated, the message was still one of fear from the health officials and governments who have clung to their emergency powers like a comfort blanket. Now, this is happening. Yet I read everything, and I cited the Epidemiology Report 22 from the federal government's own Department of Health for the period ending August 2, 2020, and it says this, comorbidities were common. See, this is the point. All these people were dying from coronavirus, were they? Or were they dying with it? Or were they dying from it? Now, I didn't bring it in here, but you could cite, as I did every day, the Department of Health, Federal Department of Health figures. At no stage did those who were seriously suffering from coronavirus exceed, was it never less than 99.8%? 99.8%. 99.8%. Now, here's the Department of Health saying comorbidities were common in those COVID-19 cases admitted to Australian hospitals, with 78% recording at least one of the specified comorbidities. So, in other words, they died with it, they didn't die from it. Only 9% recorded no comorbidities. Yet we were just brainwashed into accepting all of this nonsense, and we're paying the price for it. See, I cited the German Nazi politician and Minister for Propaganda, government didn't like it, Goebbels, from 1933 to 1945, one of Hitler's closest and most devoted associates. But I think he got it right, didn't he, when he said, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic and/or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent. For truth is the mortal enemy of the lie. And thus, by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. All right? The truth, you're cancelled if you're told the truth. I mean, let's go to the energy issue. More lies on this energy thing. Now, I have cited over and over again Professor Stephen Coonan. He was the former chief scientist to Barack Obama, a Democrat, a lefty. And he wrote a book called Unsettled. And Professor Coonan wrote, this is the year before last, wrote, leaders talk about existential threat, climate emergency, disaster, crisis. But in fact, now remember, this is the chief scientist of the President of the United States. Leaders talk about existential threat, climate emergency, disaster, we've got this today, crisis. I mean, who would listen to Greta Thunberg, an uneducated schoolgirl, and allow her to address the United Nations? If that's the level of intellectual impoverishment we've reached, we are in trouble. Don't talk to this Professor Coonan. He said, leaders talk about existential threat, climate emergency, disaster, crisis, but in fact, when you actually read the literature, there is no support for that kind of hysteria. The science is insufficient to make useful projections about how the climate will change in coming decades, much less what effect human beings will have on it. Well, you've heard me on this. Now look, the issue, they've got away from it, of course. First they started talking about global warming, and then it global warmed, so they talk about climate change. And the issue, which they don't want to admit to, they called it carbon. That's a lie. They're talking about carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a trace element in the atmosphere. In the whole world, carbon dioxide is 0.04% of the atmosphere. 0.04% of the atmosphere. Now, if you went to a kid in grade 6 and said, do you think this will cause all sorts of problems? The kid would look at you if you're stupid. However, of that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, human beings worldwide are responsible for only 3% of 0.04%. And little old Australia down here is responsible for 1.3% of 3%, of 0.04%. Where do you want to put the decimal point? And we are standing our economy on our head. Why? And this is coming back to the World Economic Forum, which want to change the world. We don't want Australia being rich. They've got us by the throat. And so we yield to all of this. We demonise coal, we demonise gas. They're forcing us to change all our appliances from gas to electricity. They don't tell us where the electricity will come from. It won't come from renewables, it'll come from coal-fired power. But here we are, denying, yielding, can't wait quickly enough to agree with all these international thugs. And here we are denying Australia the resource that has given us our wealth and our standard of living. And there we have Stephen Coonan say, leaders talk about existential threat, climate emergency, disaster, crisis. When you actually read the literature, there is no support for that kind of hysteria. Dr. John Christie is a climatologist from Alabama. I have often heard that there's a consensus of thousands of scientists on the global warming issue and that human beings are causing catastrophic change to the climate system. Well, I am one scientist, and there are many, many who think that is not true. None of these people could be heard. I interviewed many of them. And what kind of currency do you get in your country? None. You can't get a voice. Dr. Charles Wax is the former president of the American Association of State Climatologists. Dr. Charles Wax. First off, he says there isn't a consensus among scientists. Don't let anybody tell you there is. Then you've got Stanley B. Goldenberg, who's a meteorologist at the UN National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. He said, it is a blatant lie put forth in the media that makes it seem there is only a fringe of scientists who don't buy into anthropogenic global warming. William Kinnenmoth is our own man, an Australian. He's the former head of the National Climate Centre within the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. He said, quote, climate science is not settled. 4 decades of observations highlight that computer models have exaggerated the influence of anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide. The Paris Agreement has been negotiated from faulty premises. Our own man, William Kinnenmoth. Who listens to these people? No one. No one. And does the Liberal Party, the Conservatives, get into the ring and say, We're not going to be party to this kind of destruction, to this national economic suicide note, as I've called it. Richard Lindzen is one of the most eminent climatologists in the world, a professor of meteorology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He said, "What we will be leaving our grandchildren is not a planet damaged by industrial progress, but a record of unfathomable silliness, as well as a landscape degraded by rusting wind farms and decaying solar panels." Now, Michael Schellenberger, I have spoken to often, and we communicate. Michael Schellenberger, for years and years and years, was a world-renowned environmental activist. Well, 2 years ago, he wrote a book, and it's called Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. And he apologised in July 2020 for, quote, "the climate scare we have created over the past 30 years. On climate change, he said, it is not even our most serious environmental problem. Schellenberger said, once you realise how badly misinformed we've been, it's hard not to feel duped. Do any of our people representing the Conservative cause, do any of them read this stuff and prosecute? Alex Antich, you've heard from today, he does. But who else? We are lone voices, and that's why we need you people to be advocates of all of this. I mean, the Prime Minister said last year, we're moving towards net zero. This is a reality. The new energy economy is coming. You'll see it working through financial markets. Oh, come on, Albo. Stay out there in Marrickville. Once you realise, Michael Schellenberger, once you realise how badly misinformed we've been, it's hard not to feel duped. Well, as part of this reaching net zero, it's impossible to get your head around this. Chris Bowen has said, this is Bowen, he said we've got to have 22,000 50-watt solar panels every day for 8 years. 22,000, think about it, 50-watt solar panels every day for 8 years. That's one. Two, 40 7-megawatt wind turbines every month for 8 years. 40 every month. Nick Cater on ADH has done a fantastic job on this. He's gone out amongst them. And you'll see the blades of these things are phenomenal, unbelievable. Environmental damage, God, talk about it. And then 10,000 kilometres of transmission lines. And so when Perrottet was the Premier of New South Wales, he shook hands, elbows, round hands, it's good elbow, you're my mate. And they agreed to $7 billion to connect Snowy Hydro to the grid. Snowy Hydro. There'll be no bloody Snowy Hydro. It is an absolute dud. Turnbull said it'd be $2 billion. It looks like being $10 billion, and those digging the holes through the Snowy Mountains have sunk, completely sunk. So look, this is your energy policy. 0.04% of the atmosphere is causing all this damage, which means we've got to all go broke. You've got to be an intellectual wood duck to believe that stuff, And yet, what do? We line up. Yeah, put your hand up. We agree with you. Fly to Glasgow. We agree with you. And where are we heading? Have a look at your electricity bill. Then you've got, look, just when you talk about issues, they've got to win 18 seats, issues that you'd get into. Am I the only one that's fed up to the back teeth now with getting everything delivered in a brown paper bag instead of plastics, eh? What? Brown bags everywhere. Brown bags everywhere. And we're told, this is all Matt Keane, he wanted all brown bags, all plastics abolished. Matt Keane. Oh, Matt Keane, put your hand up if you want Matt Keane running government. Anyway, so if you do a bit of reading, all these single-use plastic bags, Keane wanted banned by 2025. Well, we had an inquiry into all of this. A landmark study into plastic bags by a fellow called Philip Weikart. He was a Peter Costello appointment to the Productivity Commission. He was the lead author of a report in 2006 by the Productivity Commission into waste management. And he likened the removal of plastic bags from supermarkets as a religion, suggesting arguments against plastic bags are, quote, complete furphies you can demolish in a few minutes of analysis. This was a Productivity Commission report commissioned by Peter Costello. This is Philip Weikart, he said, this is largely a religion. Plastic bags are useful, hygienic and waterproof. They have multiple uses and functions. The evidence that plastic bags hurt marine life is very unpersuasive. But then there was the University of Pennsylvania study in 2012. And I've talked to this often, and it basically said the same thing, that the plastic bag ban will kill people because reusable, quote, reusable bags increase shoppers' exposure to harmful bacteria that can infect them. Now, here we just swallowed this stuff, hook, line and sinker. No one's arguing that this is rubbish and the cost to us, and where's the landfill? Where's this all going to happen? Look, there's two more things I just want to share with you before we go. I'll be here all night. But, you know, at the end of the day, I don't want you to be intimidated, but you and I, in a sense, don't matter. Those who really matter are the 8 to 18-year-olds in our classrooms and universities. And they're going to be voting soon. They're going to be voting soon. Now, there have been any number of studies. Not one single person in government has made reference to it. But I want to share with you the first ever Australian teacher workforce data report, which was issued 2 years ago in 2021. It showed nearly half the nation's maths and foreign language teachers are not qualified to teach the subject. Nearly half. A quarter of the maths teachers surveyed said they had no training in maths. Between 36 and 46% of teachers were teaching subjects in which they had no special skill. 36 and 46%. But we continue to spend billions and billions of dollars. There was a survey, this was a survey of nearly 18,000 teachers. No government minister has come anywhere near addressing any of these issues. Politicians go on about higher pay. Doesn't solve the problem. Only 29% of those teachers said they were worried about a higher pay. They were worried about discipline. They were about the way they were treated in the classroom, being bullied by kids. A Monash University study of 6,000 teachers showed that barely a quarter planned to stay in the profession. 3/4 of the teachers surveyed in the Monash University study felt unsafe because of abusive and demanding students. One teacher complained of hitting, punching, shouting, screaming and tantrums. So why should we be surprised, therefore, to learn that we are 1.5 years behind Singapore students when it comes to reading and science, 3 years behind when it comes to maths? We used to be 4th in the world in relation to reading, we're now 16th. We used to be 8th in science, we're now 17th. We used to be 11th in maths, we're now 29th. Yet on all this failure, we're spending $130,000 million a year. A year. I spoke in 2021 to La Trobe University. They had a short course teaching in phonics, that is, spelling according to sound, the tried and tested method of teaching young people. A like an apple or a twig, and A says ah, B like a bat and ball, and B says buh. You know, that's the way we were taught. And the enrolments were in the thousands. They hadn't been taught phonics in the first place. And yet Greta Thunberg told us, and she addressed the United Nations, that we have stolen her dreams. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We're at the beginning of mass extinction. And of course, these are all lies, but they feed into the propaganda that's taught in the classroom. It feeds into the propaganda of kids. So now they think a boy can be a girl, no matter what the biology says. They put kitty litter in girls' toilets because some girls want to be cats. I mean, you can't. Who has opened their mouth on a single sentence about any of this, where we have indoctrination rather than education? I mean, Jason Clare is the new minister. He's got hairs on his chest. He thinks he knows a lot about all of this. I've asked him to come on the program. He won't come on the program because they can't answer the questions, you see. They want a soft run. And he says, oh, yes, well, we're going to have an inquiry. What do we have to inquire into? Funding. 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 I mentioned last year a Year 8 class in one high school where students were made to fill out a questionnaire asking when and how did they first decide they were heterosexual. 13. See, my point is that if someone said, when I became the Wallaby coach, he can't coach, that Alan Jones, he can't coach, then you could say, well, come down to Concord Oval or somewhere and you can watch him coach. You can find out whether he knows what he's doing or not. You can't get into the classroom to know what's going on in the most important exposure that your children have. And here we have a 13-year-old saying, when did you first decide you're heterosexual? 13 years old. It's creepy stuff. At one high school in New South Wales, students were made to kneel in homage to Black Lives Matter, an openly neo-Marxist organisation that attacks the nuclear family and promotes gender fluidity. This is what the kids are being taught. Yet every other day there's a story to tell us that things are terrific. And as I said, the struggling Year 12 students, this is a beauty, who fail exams and assignments are still passing maths and English subjects because state curriculum bodies are pushing pass marks below 50%. So the thing means absolutely nothing. As I said, we've got a Federal Education Minister, Jason Clare, and he says, oh, we're right, we're going to have an inquiry into all of this. Education policy, he said, is a strong point for Labor. And he said it's a means to improve people's lives. His exact words were, he said, the power of education changes lives. I would like Jason Clare to come on my program so that I could tell him the power of bad education destroys lives. And that's what's happening now. He's asserting that education policy is a strong point. I don't know what they've done to justify that conclusion, but as I said, he won't speak to me. His plan is to give public schools as much funding as the Gonski plan said they need. Well, at the end of the day, the issue is not funding. The issue is simple. The issue is what children are being taught or not being taught. You ask them. They haven't read a book by Bronte or Dickens or whatever. They can't recite a verse of poetry. They don't know that Bundaberg's on the Burnett River. They've never heard of Burke and Wills. And people say, oh, we don't need this to get a job. No, but to be properly educated, you need to understand these wider issues. This is capital E education. Education is not a means to escape manual labour. Education is a discipline which informs you and liberates you, and you feel a better person as a consequence. You've got a thirst for this stuff. It's not happening. So, which does bring me, if I may indulge you. Oh, we had a bloke out here, by the way, recently called Andreas Schleicher. He's the Education and Skills Director for the OECD. He said Australia has, quote, made learning often a mile wide but an inch deep. Often a mile wide. Say that about, who cares? Who takes in notes? No. A mile wide but an inch deep. He says, correctly, that top-performing education systems look at the realm of human knowledge, the realm of ethics and judgment, the realm of political and civic life, the realm of creativity, aesthetics, design, physical health, natural health and economic life. But here we spend $130 billion and achieve none of that. He said successful countries in education use rigour, making sure that students are challenged in every moment of their learning. Well, I just want to end because the much maligned Donald Trump, the much maligned Donald Trump. Donald Trump made a speech, a magnificent speech, in September 2020. And amongst other things he said, it was a conference of US history at the Washington National Archives in September 2020. He said, the left-wing rioting and mayhem are the direct result of decades of left-wing indoctrination in our schools. He said US schools and universities were teaching critical race theory. This is us too. Critical race theory, which taught young Americans that the US was a wicked and racist nation of which they should be ashamed. Our kids are taught that we're racist. We invaded. I have a very, very bright goddaughter, very bright. She's at a private school. And she was told on the 25th of January that tomorrow will not be a day of celebration. It was a day of invasion, and we should be mourning. She wanted to leap up and down and say something, but knew that if she did, she'd be failed. So this is Donald Trump. He said the left is attempting, think about us today in The Voice, the left is attempting to divide Americans by race in the service of political power. See, Peter Dutton and all these people, they go on, and I think Peter Dutton, given the wets that he's got around him, is doing a very good job. But why I think you forget the business. Yeah, but Peter should forget the business about detail. I don't want any detail. I know Albo hasn't rung the Uluru Statement. I don't want any detail about The Voice. All I want to say is I will not support a race-based change to the Constitution. That's it. I don't want any detail. I don't want any detail. Go on about treaty. How the hell you can have a treaty between one nation and a part of that nation? That's intellectual impoverishment. But I don't want any detail. I would stand in the public place, as Abbott would, remember, we'll turn back the boats. How many words? We will turn back the boats. 6 words. And he kept on saying it. We will not accept a race-based change to the continent. That's the only argument you've got to use at the tuck shop. That's the only argument you use at the tuck shop. And so because, as Donald Trump said, the left is attempting to divide Americans by race in the service of political power. That's what it's about. That's what it's about. I mean, we've got government here trying to divide Australians on the basis of race. And barely, a corporate. Have we got a corporate voice? Not many. Have we got a political voice? Well, Peter's doing the best he can, but he's got all those wets amongst the party, the Birminghams of this world. Or they're going to support the US vote. Well, that's fine. Go and find another party, is what I say. Go on somewhere else. You don't belong here. So, and then, of course, the media. Donald Trump said, by viewing every issue through the lens of race, they want to impose a new segregation. And we must not allow this to happen. The much maligned Trump. Of course, they're frightened of Trump. Of course, they want to demonise him. They want to politicise the Justice Department and the FBI. They want to weaponise all of them. This bloke's got to be gotten rid of. He's a risk to what he calls those people submerged by the swamp. He said, the crusade against American history is toxic propaganda. We've got this here. Ideological poison that, if not removed, will dissolve the civic bonds which tie us together. It will destroy our country. Trump. He said, whether it's the mob on the street or the cancel culture in the boardroom, the goal is the same: to silence dissent, to scare you out of speaking the truth, and to bully Americans into abandoning their values, their heritage, and their very way of life. That's what's on here. That's what's on here. There'll be someone recording what I'm saying here today, and oh, will I cop it? I don't care. Save your breath. Don't waste your time. Don't waste your time. You can vilify, you can intimidate, you can demonise, but you won't silence. Save your time. And ADH is the non-woke avenue to make sure that the voiceless are heard and have a voice. President Trump said, there's no more powerful force than a parent's love for their children. And patriotic mums and dads are going to demand that their children are no longer fed hateful lies about this country. American parents, he said, are not going to accept indoctrination in our schools, cancel culture at work, or the repression of traditional faith, culture and values in the public square, not anymore. So we have to get rid of him. Have to get rid of him because this has got a whole lot of people out of line and out of step. And Australian parents have to stand up and oppose this stuff. Donald Trump said then 2 years ago he would form a national commission to promote patriotic education, which will encourage a curriculum that will teach students to love America with all their heart and soul. You think our kids in the classroom today are told to love Australia with all their heart and soul, to appreciate what Western civilisation has brought to this country, what actually everyone enjoys. We were hunters and fishers and shooters before these people arrived in 1788, and now look at the industrialisation that's overtaken this country, in which everyone shares. But of course we pay $40,000 million a year, $40 billion, to Indigenous Australians to close the gap. Well, why would you close the gap if you keep it open and you get $40 billion? But that's not enough. That's not enough. So 44% of Australia is subject to native title. That native title has mineral wealth underneath it. So in the Northern Territory alone, $365 million in royalties. Where does that go? Where does it go? Who asks these questions? They're frightened to ask the questions. Well, if that's the way you go, don't expect to win 18 seats, is what I can say. Donald Trump said, students in our universities are inundated with critical race theory. This is a Marxist doctrine holding that America is a wicked and racist nation, that even young children are complicit in oppression, and that our entire society must be radically reformed. This is our kids are being taught here. This is us. He said critical race theory is being forced into our children's schools. It is being imposed into workplace training, and it's being deployed to rip apart friends, neighbours and families. Teaching this horrible doctrine to our children is a form of child abuse in the truest sense of the word. Now, this bloke's a leader, and he gets belted over the head for it. I'll make one final point, because there's lots of issues that need to be addressed, but lately there have been these bush summits. As you know, I'm the son of a farmer in Western Queensland. I saw more droughts than I want to remember. And yet at these bush summits, 2 words are not mentioned: And Liberal governments have been in power for a long, long time. The two words are water and dams. Water and dams. They're never mentioned. Never mentioned. And yet, Australia only uses 6% of its available water. For example, Lake Argyll in Western Australia releases 50 tonnes of water a second. Lake Argyll. 10% used in the Ord irrigation system. 46 tonnes, 45 to 46 tonnes of this water goes straight into the Timor Sea. 4 billion litres a day. We can move all sorts of things across Australia, but we can't move water. But the catchment area of the Fitzroy River is 50% greater than the Ord. There's water everywhere in this country. I mean, you won't get a single mention of this stuff anywhere. You go to the Queensland North Coast, that's the map, for those of you who weren't educated yesterday, but that goes up to Cape York, and on that side, that's the northeast of Australia. So at the northeast, it's 4 times, the available water is 4 times that of the Murray-Darling Basin. 4 times that of the Murray-Darling Basin. So the Murray-Darling Basin is less than 23,000 gigalitres. The northeast coast, that region there, has 70,000 gigalitres going into the sea. But then move across the Gulf of Carpentaria, with Western Queensland, where Bob Catter and these people are, and you've got 1,000 gigalitres, a gigalitre is 1,000 Olympic swimming pools. And all this water is not harvested, it's not used. We can build a Darwin to Alice Springs railway line, we can send gas across Australia, but we can't do anything about water. And we had Jack Beale. Jack Beale was a minister in the pre-1950 governments in New South Wales, Jack Beale, and he made the very valid point. And he said, talking about not harvesting water, and he proposed the development of the Clarence River Basin, not far from here, just up the north coast, as you know, in northern New South Wales. He said he would create a giant water and power project that would dwarf the Snowy Mountain scheme. Now, all that water currently goes into the ocean. He said a nation, now this is 1948, a nation can't afford to let resources remain idle even if it has to build pyramids. Can't allow its resources to remain idle. Well, we've swallowed all this gumph, and so our coal, we don't want it. Our gas, we don't want it. We listen to Daniel Andrews. I wouldn't listen to Daniel Andrews if he was offering afternoon tea. But Daniel Andrews, these people are running the show. Anastasia Palaszczuk running the show. Chris Bowen with 32% of the vote. So what I'm saying to you, we are here at a major conference, hopefully to disseminate ideas, hopefully to take ideas away, hopefully to reinvigorate ourselves to recognise that the Conservative forces are under threat. We are not some extremist group. We are radical Conservatives. We're radical enough to know what has to change, and a lot of things has to change. But we also want to conserve the value system that kept Australia great and made good people into better people in this country. Your contribution to that is very important. I thank you for coming, I thank you for listening, and have a wonderful conference. I know it's here. Thank you. See ya. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, how good is Alan Jones?